Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kahuna webinar. This is Samir Patel speaking. I'm the CEO at Kahuna. Thank you very much for joining us. We're here today to talk about marketplaces, specifically about one of the most exciting regions in the world where marketplaces are thriving, and that's Latin America, of course. With me today, just before I get into that agenda-wise, it's a pretty quick webinar. We wanted to make the best use of your time and try to pack in as much as we could in 30 minutes. We'll spend 5 minutes just getting it set up, and then spend the bulk of the time on panel questions, and then save a few minutes for Q&A. I'd request that you please enter your Q&A questions in the chat. And feel free to enter those questions or write those questions in English or in Spanish, whatever you're most comfortable with. Obviously, our panelists are well versed in both, and they can address those questions as they come. So with that, it gives me a ton of pleasure to introduce the two panelists who have joined us today. The first is Gaston Irigoyen from Restaurando. For most of you in Latin America, Restaurando, at least in portions of it, probably doesn't need much of an introduction. We're privileged to be a partner to Restaurando. Restaurando is by every measure, a juggernaut across Latin America, starting off in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, and then expanding through Bogota, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and Mexico. So welcome, Gaston. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Samir. Great to be here.
Great. Not to be outdone is Carlos Jordan, CEO of Ultracasas. Personal story, Carlos and I met about a month ago, and I was, I guess about the time that I was in Buenos Aires with Gaston as well, and a few weeks later we met with Carlos, and I was truly inspired by both his energy and the ambition that Ultracasas have. They are undoubtedly the market leader in real estate in Bolivia. And Carlos is going to help us try to understand how you might expand into other markets. So one of the great things about the two panelists is Gaston's done it, been there, done that, entered a bunch of different markets, and he's going to share what they did, things they learned. Carlos has those ambitions and he's done his homework, and he's going to try to share how he's thinking about expanding beyond Bolivia. A little about who we are in Kahuna. Kahuna is a customer engagement platform designed specifically for marketplaces. What we do every day, day in and day out, is help our customers figure out how to grow and retain both the buy side and the sell side, and to help them drive liquidity. So we're privileged to be partnering with companies all over the world that are looking to build out their own versions of leading marketplaces in their own countries. 7 of the #1 regional marketplaces on the planet all use Kahuna today to drive growth. I'm happy to share more details offline. I don't want to make this about Kahuna, but thank you again for spending some time with us. So I won't spend too much time on this. This is a known fact, but just to set this up, there are 15 other stats that will help prove that Latin America is a huge market and is playing a pivotal role in the next version of digital commerce. As economies across the world move from a very warehouse to buyer mentality, from a sort of a warehouse to buyer mentality to one of connecting buyers and sellers in every single category. Latin America is at the forefront of that. We spent a lot of time in the region. We invest heavily in the regions, and we see customers of all kinds. And so, every company there, what is most inspiring is thinking well beyond the borders of the country that they began in. And that's why we chose to do this webinar, to help companies expand outside of the initial regions that they start with. This question comes up quite often about exactly what is a marketplace. So I wanted to spend a minute on defining precisely what a marketplace is. Quite loosely defined from our perspective, it is any business that brings buyers and sellers together and does not hold inventory. So we see marketplaces, broadly speaking, in 4 categories. One is classifieds, which I think we've all seen. The second is consumer services, be that businesses like Restaurando that are helping diners find restaurants. It could be food delivery. It could be It could be services such as finding help handymen or people who can help you with tasks, or doctors on demand. We have a whole slew of services right now where very creative marketplaces are disintermediating old businesses by bringing the provider and the consumer together. And then, of course, there are other categories like jobs and travel as well. So that's kind of the broader category. Today, we're obviously going to focus on two areas: consumer services, which is what Gaston's going to help us with, and then classifieds, which is Carlos's specialty. While there are big opportunities to grow, there is no question that there are some very, very specific nuances that define how successful or not a company might be when they're looking to expand outside of their comfort zone, which might be either a particular category or a country that they do business in. And so, the broad buckets that we discussed with the panel were cultural nuances, language dialects, economies, currencies, and then laws and regulation. But I wanted to now use this as an opportunity to really have the panelists sort of help us dig right into these and help us figure out exactly what are those reasons why that you can be wildly successful and what are some of the pitfalls that you might want to avoid. So let's get started. It's very easy to look inside out from your business and look at the 5 or 4 things that you have full control over that you might want to be able to influence when you're looking at expanding markets. But very often, as we all know in our businesses, there are external factors, sometimes outside of our control, that might have a big impact on whether we end up being successful and how successful when we enter markets. So Gaston, I want to start with you. When you look at external factors that you either had planned for or they were unplanned, how would you look at, what would you list out as some of the critical things that that were important for you to consider when you guys were looking at formulating your own growth strategy?
Sure. So first and foremost, I would say here in Latin America, as we well know, we live in very cyclical countries and changing economies. So generally speaking, everyone who's been around for a few years knows that we're going to go through ups and downs, and it may be in one country or the other, but in Latin America, we're constantly going through cycles and ups and downs. So doing business here is all about resilience and being able to adapt and to get creative to tackle all those obstacles. So we're very used to nuances and challenges, and this happens all the time. Just to give you a few very recent examples, here in Argentina, we went through a massive devaluation of our currency during the last 6 or so months. So for instance, back in October 2017, one American dollar was worth 17 Argentinian pesos, then was down to 21 pesos in January, and now we're down to 28 pesos. So that's more than 50% devaluation in about 9 months, which is unheard of and something that usually doesn't happen around the world. And if you think in terms of our own company structure being funded by international investors, thinking in American dollars, we had to adapt to the situation, and we went through a couple of price increments just to make sure that our revenues could stay where they were in terms of international currencies. Yeah. Just to give you another example, a few months ago there was a truck strike in Brazil, preventing the food supplies in terms of reaching the restaurants, and as a result of that, people weren't going out. The restaurants didn't have enough food. So our entire business was in a difficult situation for a couple of weeks. And even on a funny side, if you want, but it's also related to what you mentioned on the previous slide about cultural nuances. Yeah. We recently had the World Cup, and the World Cup is a massive thing for those who love soccer or football in Latin America, which is most of us. And so that impacts the business, and people get together with friends, and as a result of that, they don't go to restaurants that much, and so we have to plan for that. So yeah, those are some examples of things that we're very used to here.
one story that I heard when I was visiting you guys a couple of weeks ago, which I found quite interesting as well, which is, on the cultural nuance side, understanding, for example, someone said that, culturally in Argentina, for example, providing offers and discounts are acceptable, but it may not be in other countries, right? So talk a little, I was quite inspired by that because it's not something that I thought through, but give me an example culturally. What are some of the things that, you think the audience needs to think about when they enter countries? And I know you guys don't do this, but definitely very often in the US, people kind of look at Latin America as one thing, and obviously it's not. What were some of your biggest cultural findings?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I was lucky to live both in Europe and in the US. And I don't think in about 7 years I had a single discount when dining out at a restaurant. Whereas here in Argentina, it's absolutely common to get a 20, 30, 40% discount at a restaurant. And this is something that has been around in our country, not only in restaurants, but in different areas of business for the last 16 or 17 years after we had a massive crisis back in 2001. So a big chunk of our business is driven by discounts in Argentina. Just to give you an idea, 55% of our reservations come with some sort of discount attached in this country. Whereas if we look at Mexico or Colombia, discounts, it's not that they don't exist, but they are usually executed in a different way. For instance, they kind of package a menu together and they give you a fixed price for that menu, which sort of has a discount somewhere in there. But it's not in the same terms as in Argentina. So that's massive if you think in terms of the product and the execution, how to acquire restaurants, how to communicate to diners. It's a completely different story.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is, I think, that was eye-opening for me when I was sitting down with your colleagues back there. Carlos, what are your thoughts on this? What are some of the things that you're looking at that are on your radar as you look, you set your sights, towards bigger goals?
Hi everyone. Thanks Sesame for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Carlos, you're a little faint. I don't know whether it's just me or.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, much better. Perfect.
Great. So thanks Samir for the invitation. Hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So on your question, what we think is a critical aspect here in the Latin market is the internet penetration. Even though we know that at least 90% of our population has access to the internet, that does not mean that these people is actually interacting with the internet as much as developed countries.
Yeah.
Just as an example, in the US, you have 300 million people. In Mexico, you have 125 million people.
Yeah.
Zillow, which is the #1 in real estate in the US, has 90 million visits a month, sessions. And Viva Anuncios has 8 million. And in reality, it should have 40 million. So it's like 1/5.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say here is that we in Latin, we need to evolve our technology to get the conversion we're looking for, make it faster, because we don't have as many people interacting with the internet, and we need to get the juice out of the tiny time we have in comparison with developed countries.
Got it.
That's one of the big things we have learned, understanding Latin markets against developed countries. Couple of other things that I think are important. The mobile one, in Latin America, most of the traffic is done through mobile, 70% at least compared with desktop. So it's important to start with mobile. This is critical to success in countries like Latin and regions like Asia and Africa.
Yeah.
And finally, for us, what has been a critical thing has been the payment methods. We need to be flexible on this. In countries like Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, where we had some interacts with other startups, you may think that paying with credit cards is the main source, but it's not in reality. B2B businesses tend to pay more with transactions or still with checks. So we need to be flexible on those three things. So those are the things we learned regarding external factors when we're looking into the Latin market.
Yeah, I love it, and it's something that we see across our customer base as well. Because I mean, really, what you guys are both saying is that, you know, when you think about the technology decisions that you're making, the flexibility, extreme flexibility, is a big thing, because you're going to need to turn left and right. You can't do a one size fits all across the market. All right, I'm going to keep moving through this. One of the things that was most exciting to me about having specifically the two of you on this is, you know, when we look at trying to figure out signals, what are those right signals that tell you that you should look at an external market? The beautiful thing about both the experiences that you both have is, Carlos, you know, you've been focused on getting it right in Bolivia, and you've been looking at internal signals about your business that will tell you whether it's time to go outside. Gaston, you're a couple of steps ahead. You already have done this in a couple of countries, and you have a playbook. So, Carlos, let's start with you this time. You know, what are the signals you should be looking at internally about your business that you would tell the audience before they decide to go outside their first markets?
Good. We have some mentors around the world. We have some fellas from eBay, from Cello-J, and we constantly talk about this. When is it time to move out? And there's some guidelines. It's extremely dynamic, but I guess this is going to work as some specific guidelines on what to look at. For instance, you should reach around 50% of your market traffic before you start looking into new traffic, into new market. Also reach an adequate percentage of revenue. You should at least be close to break even in your own market, or at least foresee it if you want to start entering into a new one. So those are two really important signals.
Carlos, why do you say that? Like, the break-even one's an interesting point. Why is that a signal?
Because if you're able to reach break-even within your own market, that means that you're doing things right. And once you enter into a new market, you will have less surprises to deal with.
Gotcha. Okay, so that means you figured out everything from the economies of your business, the economics of your business, the technologies you require, and you feel confident about your playbook. That's the point.
Correct, certainly, and that relates with the third point that I was going to mention. Have all your technology, your processes, they have to be lean, they have to be consistent. If you're having trouble within your own market, once you open to new ones, it's just going to be a nightmare. So first, make sure that the house is ready before you start getting new houses, in other words.
Yeah.
And finally, your technology, you should be a mature state. Usually we know that it's going to continue to evolve on a daily basis, but we also know that we have a 70-80% that we need as a base. If you don't have that ready, it's way too risky to start entering into new markets. So first, have all those points together. At least that's what we've agreed with all these mentors from this big companies around the world to have ready before you start looking into new markets. Awesome. And then when you look outside, I would say that you need to bring something new and disruptive to the table. Mm-hmm. If you're just going to come in with the regular service, just as everybody else, is going to be extremely complicated. So you should start looking into artificial intelligence. There you guys come in, Kahuna.
Thank you.
Better technology, related services. You should have new, interesting sources of revenue. Data analysis and outstanding SEO, things like that. So you're going to have a competitive advantage once you are going to go into a big market and fight with the big ones.
Love it. Thank you. Gaston, give us a minute or two on, how do you develop playbooks when you're expanding?
Yeah, for us, it was different from Carlos. I think that if you can be profitable in your own market, that's a super healthy way to expand. That's not typically what I've seen or what we're used to. I think when we expanded to different markets, I don't think we were profitable at any of them at the time we made those decisions. For us, it was because it's a kind of a winner takes all, or at least a winner takes most type of marketplace. I think we wanted to move relatively fast. Generally speaking, in Latin America, to win, you have to conquer every single market, or at the very least, Brazil on the one hand, and then Spanish-speaking Latin America on the other hand. So when we launched, we kind of launched simultaneously both in Argentina and Brazil, and then we made our way up. So we took a south to north sort of approach, starting with the South Cone, that being Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, then moving into the Andean region, which includes Colombia, Peru, Chile sometimes is referred as to Andean region as well, Ecuador, and our latest country was Mexico, which in many ways is a little bit counterintuitive given the size and the nature of Mexico.
Sure.
Yeah, and then in terms of signals, I think I would summarize and say that when picking a country in Latin America, you look at two things. One is the market size / opportunity. Not all countries are equally big in terms of market opportunity, and that doesn't necessarily correlate with the size of the population. And then the ability to replicate the success that you've had in your original country or wherever you are strong. So for instance, we look at things like on the supply side, like the number of restaurants, the average ticket price, the margin that a restaurant has, because at the end of the day, we charge a take rate. So for instance, in the US, restaurant margins can be as low as 8%, whereas in countries like Colombia, they can be as high as 20%. So it's much easier to charge like a 5, 6, 7% take rate when the restaurant has a 20% margin. Otherwise, you're eating the entire profit out of the restaurant. And then from the demand side, we look at things like disposable income or dining out trends or credit card adoption. So for instance, in that respect, Chile could be a little bit counterintuitive because it's a rather small country in terms of population, but they have lots of disposable income, very high salaries, very strong dining out trends. So, Chile was a no-brainer at the time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's really, really insightful. All right, so we're going to go to the last question. And, for both of you guys, what are, for each of you, what are 2 mistakes or wrong assumptions you think you made when looking at expanding into markets? What were things that seemed obvious but turned out in hindsight to be wrong? So Carlos, you're kind of ahead of that. You're one step ahead, but as you're looking out, give us 2, and then I'll turn to Gaston, and then we'll get to Q&A.
Good. It's 2 basic ones. Do not underestimate your competitors. You may think that you can analyze them and understand their current status, but once you jump in, they're certainly going to start to evolve.
Yeah.
So you at least need to be prepared or plan ahead so you know what to do when this happens,
yeah.
What you else have under your sleeve to fight that evolution, and also do not overestimate your market. We always do all these beautiful business plans, and in reality, they never come out as planned. So make sure you have your plan B, your plan C, and you're ready to do all sorts of techniques and improvements to get the market running as expected.
So give me one example of the latter. Like what would you say that, something that's a little specific on the second one?
For instance, you want to try to move your market to start paying. This one classifies as a big thing. Always when you start, you're a freemium and you want to turn into pay to list.
Yeah.
So on this aspect, you need to start educating your market fast so they know that it's going to be free only for a certain period of time. Yeah. And your technology has to allow you to start turning all those leads, all the money into the ones who are paying. Yeah. So that has to be done fast so you start generating revenue fast. If you just let people get used to things being free, it's going to be extremely complicated to change that in time.
Got it. Cool. Gaston.
Yeah, so I'll give you one example of what we...
You're supposed to say restaurant made no mistakes. That's how you're supposed to say.
No, I think we made a rather big mistake in terms of expanding too much too soon. And I think this was particularly true for the case of Brazil. We wanted to have that first mover advantage there. So we went into too many cities too fast. And we almost kind of forgot the fact that, to have a good marketplace dynamics, you have to have like a very good amount of supply and demand and liquidity around in each one of those cities. And I think, that wasn't kind of the perfect move. So, and we kind of stepped back a little bit and thought, hey, it's probably worth having presence in less cities, but trying to be more powerful and impactful in each one of those. And as a matter of fact, just to give you an example of how we have kind of cross-corrected that, Our current strategy is basically to focus on less cities. We're present in 18 cities, but there are 5 or 6 that we really pay attention to and are super proactive. And we try to squeeze the lemons out of those cities. And there are some interesting things that we've done and that have been very eye-opening in terms of being able to drive as much business as having launched entire new cities. So just to give you an example, in terms of pricing, when you develop a leading position, you can increase your take rates. And when you increase your take rates, that impacts a lot in your P&L, and you can increase your revenues dramatically. In some cases, we have doubled our revenues. And in a city like Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo, that would be equivalent to opening 5, 6, 7 cities around Latin America. So that's kind of one example. Then another good example is our product offering. What we decided to do is to have a more comprehensive product offering in the cities that we operate. So as of recently, we not only do restaurant reservations, but we started to tap into a new, bigger opportunity, which is allowing people to dine out without having a reservation. So that's another interesting way to expand our product catalog and to allow diners to go out in more flexible ways, and at the same time drive much more demand for our restaurants.
Awesome. Great. So let's go to Q&A. I think the first question is a really, I think, it would be great for probably everybody wants to know this is, Carlos, I'll start with you. What is your, when there is a dominant competitor already in the region that you're looking to expand to, which is likely the case these days, what is one thing that you would say, people in the audience should think about as they're trying to, squeeze or elbow into a market that's established? Carlos, did I lose you?
Okay, sorry, here I am. So what I was saying is that you need to be creative, you need to evolve, you need to bring something new to the table. You need to have better technology, you need to have artificial intelligence on your side. If you just fight with the regular weapons, you won't be able to win that fight. So as long as you bring something new, you have an opportunity.
Got it. Okay, Gaston, what is the one thing you would say when you're entering a new market?
Yeah, I think the most important thing would be to be able to adapt your core value proposition. What works in your core market may not necessarily work in the exact same terms in a different market. So if you have a dominant competitor there, I would be very thorough in terms of understanding how has their dominance been built and how can you adapt your core value proposition to make it different or capture a segment of the market. And just to give you an example, in Mexico, we compete with OpenTable, and so the American player. And so OpenTable are used to charging a flat fee, and then on top of that, charging for every seated diner. So our approach when we landed in Mexico was to kind of remove any sort of flat fee just to charge for diners, which means that if we didn't send any diners to a restaurant, then we wouldn't charge them anything. So it was easier for restaurants to make the decision to either switch or join Restaurando because there was absolutely no risk.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, one last question. One of the things that struck me when I spent time in Latin America with our customers is, and while this is slightly off script of the webinar, what was really interesting to me is many of you guys have always talked about not just expanding in Latin America, but you guys look outside the US as well. Outside Latin America as well, to Europe specifically, or even Asia in some cases. And I have plenty of those examples. Give me just one reason each of you on why should other marketplaces in Latin America look at other countries outside of Latin America just as they would another country there? Do you have an opinion on why that is something that is quite prevalent in your category?
Yeah, I can start with that one. Yes, there are some companies doing that. So for instance, our friends at Workana are now opening an office in Southeast Asia, and they're trying to capture that market. Yep. I think it's a brave move, slightly counterintuitive. I think if we look at the most successful companies over the last 20, 25 years in Latin America, what they've done is they have focused in Latin America and built huge and super successful ecosystems within the region. So Mercado Libre, Despegar, just to state a few examples. And there's plenty of room ahead of us still. So if you ask me, I think there's a lot more to win by focusing and doubling down in Latin America as opposed to looking at other markets. Needless to say that we can capture kind of inbound, in our case, inbound travel, right? So there's lots of travelers from around the world who come to Latin America, and that's a huge market opportunity for us.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a good point. I can tell you when I downloaded the Restaurando app, when I landed there, it was kind of hard to go back to OpenTable and Yelp because it was a one-stop shop. So I get that. Carlos, what do you give us? We're a little over time, so quickly.
Good. So on classifieds side, Latin America is extremely competitive. If you look into Mexico, there are over 8 big players trying to win that cake. Also in Argentina, Chile. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you look into developed countries, the US, Europe, Australia, there's always 1 or 2 big players, and it's extremely complicated to take them down. So they will remain there most likely. Yeah. So the next step is to look into Asia and Africa. And I know a lot of the players in Latin America are actually doing it. It seems like a good opportunity. You don't have as much competition. You have really well-developed countries. Yeah. And I know a few already trying it, and it's a really interesting place to look at.
Yes, I agree with you. We're seeing a ton of our customers come to us with that these days. All right, I want to take one more question before everybody decides that people are still here. So one last question is, someone asks, what payment methods do you use online for your marketplaces? Gaston, are you guys using homegrown, or are you guys using something else for payments?
Yeah, so technically speaking, we don't process any payments. We just facilitate the reservation or the dining out experience, and then the payment happens offline. Right. As it was mentioned before, I think in Latin America, you first and foremost have to be flexible. In Argentina, there's a huge cash culture, whereas in countries like Brazil or Chile, there's a huge credit card adoption. So once again, I think you have to have that ability to adapt. We're starting to see from the big players like Mercado Libre that they're trying to push the QR codes. For instance, I was pumping some fuel into my car this morning and I just scanned the QR code. So there's a little bit of that online to offline thing now going on.
Got it. Okay. Carlos, any opinion there?
The regular ones, usually for B2B businesses, this is going to actually work better. Regular bank transfers, there are some services where you can go and pay in a pharmacy or in a little store. So you should have all those available. You need that flexibility.
Got it. Excellent. All right, we are 4 minutes over. I want to thank both of you very much. Those were amazing insights, as always, and I think you guys provided very, very tactical information, so I really appreciate that. To everybody in the audience who took the time to join us for these 35 minutes, I appreciate it as well. If you'd like to know more about Kahuna, there's some information on the slide that you're looking at. Again, Gaston and Carlos, thank you so much on behalf of all of us.
Thanks, Amir.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Amir. Thanks, everyone.